spirit as we recover our economy, they will need extra support to get through this crisis. Some businesses will not want to take on more debt, which is why our focus has been on cash grants, tax cuts, and tax deferrals. But for others, loans will be part of the answer. So today we are announcing a new microloan scheme, providing a simple, quick, easy solution for those in need of smaller loans. Businesses will be able to apply for these new bounce-back loans for 25% of their turnover, up to a maximum of £50,000, with the government paying the interest for the first 12 months. My right honourable friend, the Economic Secretary, and I have been in close talks with the banks, and I'm pleased to say that these loans will be available from 9 a.m. next Monday. There will be no forward-looking tests of business viability, no complex eligibility criteria, just a simple, quick, standard form for businesses to fill in. For most firms, loans should arrive within 24 hours of approval. And I've decided for this specific scheme that the government will support lending by guaranteeing to the lender 100% of the loan. And let me address this point directly, Mr. Speaker. I've heard some calls for government to underwrite all our loan schemes with 100% guarantees. I remain unconvinced by the case for doing that universally. We should not ask the ordinary taxpayers of today and tomorrow to bear the entire risk of lending almost unlimited sums to businesses who may in some cases have very little prospect of paying those loans back, and not necessarily because of the impact of the coronavirus. So I do not think it is appropriate to provide 100% guarantees on all of our schemes. Instead, these new bounce-back loans carefully target that extraordinary level of state support at those who need it most. And the £50,000 cap balances the risk to the taxpayer with the need to support our smallest businesses. Mr. Speaker, right now, the most important thing for the health of our economy is the health of our people. We are making progress in our fight against the virus, but we are not there yet. So our strategy is to protect people and businesses through this crisis by backing our public services and NHS with increased funding, strengthening our safety net to support those most in need, and supporting people to stay in work and keep their businesses going. Our response is comprehensive, coherent, and coordinated. It is, I believe, the right approach. And I hope I can continue to rely on the support and advice of all honourable and right honourable members as I commend this statement to the House.
Can I now welcome the new Shadow Chancellor, Annalise Dodds, with 5 minutes to respond. Annalise Dodds.
Thank you, Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Chancellor for advance sight of his statement. I'm also very grateful to all the Treasury, civil servants and those working in HMRC and DWP who've been working incredibly hard to get these schemes running. I fully appreciate that the Chancellor's job has not been an easy one. Nonetheless, it is our job as a constructive opposition to point to problems that we're hearing from the front line and to indicate solutions. And it appears that at least some of those problems are more acute in our country than in many others. The Purchasing Managers' Index figures that came out last week indicated a sharp fall in business confidence, and that sadly wasn't a surprise. It's been clear for some time that the economic slowdown we're currently experiencing is sharp and deep. It was, however, unsettling that those figures suggested that business confidence has taken a stronger hit in the UK than across the Eurozone. I've heard from small business owners who put their life and soul into their firms, but they've less than 2 weeks of cash flow left and they're devastated. We all need to work together to get the different support schemes working for our country. We must fix this. Now, I'm well aware that many of the conditions for shifting out of lockdown are not within the Chancellor's grasp. However, there are matters where his government needs to be open about blocks on progress and how it will remove them. That applies to the test, track and trace regime, which must be in place before key sectors can open again. It also applies to the creation of a national tripartite system to ensure workers and employers have confidence that they can return to work safely when the right time comes. The Chancellor is directly responsible for the economic package, and he knows we supported him in creating the furlough scheme, for example. Indeed, we called for it. But the evidence is that some other key elements of the economic package are failing. So in a constructive spirit, I want to ask the Chancellor whether he would countenance solutions in three areas. First, CBILS. It's a relief to hear from the Chancellor that he's listened to calls from this side of the House, business and others, that we need a full guarantee for at least some loans. He stated up to those of £50,000. But we need to be clear, the UK has an enormous mountain to climb in this area. Switzerland has a population of under 9 million, yet it approved 4 times as many loans within its first week than the UK has done in a month. We're running out of time, so can I ask the Chancellor how he'll ensure the bounce-back loans get to those businesses that need it? How will they get out of the door? And what plans does he have to ensure the capacity will be there in banks to provide those loans? Second, recent figures suggest 1 in 10 in our workforce looks set to be unemployed as a result of this crisis, with all that entails for people's future prospects, incomes, and their families' health. Again, I say to the Chancellor, we will work with him. We've indicated many of the gaps within existing schemes to protect incomes, and will continue to push for these to be filled. However, we must be clear. The reason why those gaps are such an income-crushing, insecurity-producing crisis for so many is because the only alternative to coverage by these schemes for many is in most cases universal credit. Universal credit which pushes people right down to an average of 10% of the income of the rest of the workforce. The DWP has made some welcome changes, but failure to change the initial loan into a grant threatens to create even more of a debt crisis among households. Apparently, the government is sympathetic to changing the loan into a grant, but we're told the computer system just won't allow it. So my second question is, will he knock heads together and get the computers to say yes to switching UC loans into grants? Finally, as he knows, before this crisis, we had an economy which for so many simply did not work. Around a quarter of all families lacked just £100 in savings, even before the crisis began. The UK is the most regionally unequal country in Europe, and we've just had the longest squeeze on living standards, not just in a generation, but in 8 generations. The recovery from this crisis must be faster and wider. To ensure as many people as possible have a job to come back to, we need a flexible furlough scheme. The Chancellor told me previously it can't currently be made more flexible, but other countries have done this. Will he work to amend the furlough scheme to allow workers to come back on a part-time basis? And will he do as so many other countries are doing, from Germany to New Zealand, and talk about how those hit hard by the crisis can be supported, not just now but in the future as well, with employment boosting, redeploying and retaining schemes? The aftermath of the pit closures tells us that an approach where the government shrugs its shoulders will scar our economy for generations to come. So my last question is, will he work together with me, trade unions, businesses and local authorities to develop a plan to offer the hope of work to those who have already become unemployed and get our economy moving again?
Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I welcome the Shadow Chancellor to her place and thank her for the constructive dialogue that I've had with her over the past 2 or so weeks. And let me address her questions directly and swiftly. Firstly, with regard to the loan guarantee programme about the bank's operational capacity, obviously this is something that both the Economic Secretary and I have spent a lot of time on over the past few weeks, working with the banks. I'm grateful to them for re-engineering their entire systems to offer this brand new bounce-back loan. I am assured it will be available from next Monday morning. It will have a very simple application process, and the banks will not have to conduct more than customary fraud anti-money laundering checks, which of course would be reduced on existing customers that they have. If you have an existing business account with the bank, it should prove incredibly rapid, and within a day or 2 you should have cash in your bank account. They are readying their systems for that launch date as we speak. With regard to Switzerland, and I hear this a lot from many many commentators that we should copy what they did in Switzerland, Mr. Speaker. Now, it's worth bearing in mind, Switzerland do have 100% guaranteed loans. I absolutely agree that they do. It's worth bearing in mind that Switzerland also don't do very much else in the way of direct fiscal support for their businesses. And indeed, after extensive dialogue with the Swiss government, it is very clear that for them, the loan guarantee scheme is the primacy of their direct fiscal support to businesses. In this country, we have done tens of billions of pounds in direct cash support through tax cuts, through reducing business rates, through cash grants of £10,000 or £25,000, to paying people's statutory sick pay bill. These very direct cash impacts, I believe, are more generous than asking companies to take on a loan, which is why I believe the Switzerland comparison is not analogous. And secondly, the Switzerland furlough scheme requires employers to contribute a fifth of the payment to the scheme, whereas in this country, our furlough scheme removes that very considerable cash burden from businesses. So as I always say, when I'm at this dispatch box or answering questions elsewhere, Mr. Speaker, it is important to look at the totality of all our economic interventions. When measured as a percentage of GDP, it is very clear to me, as has been empirically shown by others, that the sum total of our fiscal intervention to support businesses and people through this crisis is one of the most comprehensive and generous in terms of scope and scale anywhere in the world. Turning to the next question around universal credit and support for the most vulnerable, I firmly agree, Mr. Speaker, that during this crisis we must, of course, look after the most vulnerable in our society. And from the budget onwards, I have strived to do exactly that. We have invested extra funds into tax credits, into universal credit, improved eligibility to statutory sick pay, improved the employment support allowance, improved how these schemes work for self-employed, improved the local housing allowance, and indeed created a brand new hardship fund for local authorities to help people with their council tax bills. All of these investments have sum total of over £7 billion of investment by this government to strengthen the safety net to help the most vulnerable in our society through this difficult period. And lastly, with regard to the future, I wholeheartedly believe that the best way out of this is to ensure that as many people as possible can return to the job that they had. That is the best way to protect people, to protect their livelihoods, their families, their household incomes, which is why all of our support has been conducted with that aim in mind. How can we help support businesses? How can we help them to keep their employees attached to that business? I believe that our furlough scheme stands at the centre of that. All the other interventions will help support that aim, so that as we emerge from this crisis, Mr. Speaker, we can get back as quickly as possible to the life that we once knew.
We now go across to Teresa Villiers. Teresa Villiers.